Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Monday, July the 11th. And welcome to our commentary. As I always like to do on Mondays, I remind you that on Monday afternoons, Monday evenings, we record a podcast that we call The Week in Review. And that podcast is with our good friend Bill Katz, the editor of The Urgent Agenda. Great website. You should be checking it out. And we're going to get into a lot of stories today. And one of the stories that we're going to get into is this incident in New York where the owner of a bodega got into a confrontation with somebody and they ended up arresting the owner of the bodega because, in self defense, he killed the intruder. Now, it's a complicated story. We'll get into it more, but uh, this is, to me, just a reflection of where the city of New York is with respect to lawlessness. Here you have a 61-year-old man. He's 61 years old. He owns the bodega. He's well regarded in the community. Look, I have experience with bodegas because I grew up in a Spanish culture. And when I was a little boy in Cuba, my mother would send me to the bodega from time to time to pick up things. And bodegas are these businesses particularly in small towns, that are very often the center of the community. That's where people go to drink coffee. That's where they go to talk. That's where they pick up a newspaper, and that's where they buy things. So bodegas are a big part of the communities, and you can still see them in New York City. These bodegas and other places, but particularly in New York City, you can certainly see them in Miami, maybe LA, wherever you have large Hispanic populations. And this 61-year-old man, who's the owner, is running the bodega. He's behind the cashier, and it's all on video if you want to see it. Apparently, a lady gets into an argument with him, and then the lady's boyfriend gets into it with the owner, and the owner, in self defense, stabs him, kills him, and then he's arrested and being charged with murder. It's a huge scandal in New York. The people of New York are angry about this because, as I said before, it reflects the lawlessness that you're seeing in some of these cities. So we're going to get into it tonight with Bill on the Week in Review. Again, the whole idea that a 35-year-old man would attack a 61-year-old, that alone should tell you something about this. And then, to make matters worse, the 35-year-old guy who was unfortunately was killed, he's a career criminal. He's been in all kinds of trouble. So it just makes you wonder, what in the heck is going on in places like New York City where stuff like this is happening? I mean, it's just absolutely, absolutely horrible. So we're going to get into that with Bill because, of course, he lives in New York City area. I have a post over at the American Thinker today. I'd like you to check out. You can see it at the American Thinker or on my blog. I always put these on Facebook as well, so you can check it out there. And it has to do with a couple of Latinas who are driving the left crazy. The first one is the lady in South Texas who just won her election to the U.S. Congress in the middle of June, and she ran on a campaign of God, family, and faith, and apparently this patriotism. This is apparently driving the left crazy. They think that she's an extremist, and the New York Times wrote an article about this woman saying that she's hanging on to extremist points of view, like God, the country, and faith. That is now suddenly extremist. I mean, that's crazy. But what's also interesting is that if you had gone to South Texas 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when it was 100% Democrat, they were running on those topics as well, but they were not called extremist. They've only been called extremist when they're Republicans winning the election. That's an interesting point. So the people of South Texas have not changed. They've always been very family oriented, very God oriented, very country oriented. That has not changed. What's changed is the Democrat Party. That's what's changed. And the fact that they would call somebody like this an extremist, it's a reflection on the Democrat Party. Now, the other lady who's driving them crazy is a radio host down in Miami. Now, I have to confess, I'm not familiar with her. I've not heard her shows, but she's a conservative lady on Radio Mambi, which is a very popular station in Miami. It's a very Cuban station now with Venezuelans. It's very popular with Venezuelans too. It's a very conservative, anti-communist type, broadcast, and it's a good broadcast. I've picked up some of their shows from time to time, but I'm not familiar with this lady who that was the topic of so much outrage. Now, her name is Lourdes Ubieta, I think her name is Lourdes Ubieta, and she resigned as the host of this station. She said, I'm not going to cut a deal or do any contract with an organization owned by George Soros. What's happened is an organization owned by George Soros has bought many of these radio stations, Spanish radio stations. And of course, the fear is that they're going to be tilting the news coverage and the opinions in favor of the left. In at least in that station and in Miami, that's not something that Cuban Americans and Venezuelans and others want to hear. So this lady, instead of accepting the new offer from this new Soros organization, she walked away and she went to work for another outlet. So we congratulate Lourdes for standing up for principle, and we congratulate Maida Flores in South Texas for being a Latina. Both of these Latinas are driving the left crazy in the United States. But you know why? You know why the left is complaining about them? Because something is happening with the Hispanic vote. We've talked about this before. Hispanics are moving away from the Democrat Party. And the big reason is the Democrat Party is moving away from them. It's not that all of a sudden Hispanics are patriotic or that they love God or family. They've always been that way. But at one time, the Democrat Party was that way, but not anymore. And that's why you're seeing such an outrage in South Texas, as well as other Hispanic communities across the country. So check out our podcast today with our friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. We're going to talk about this. We're also going to talk about the fact that President Biden, his ratings just keep going down. A brand new poll came out, has him at 29%. Rasmussen, which is the one that I follow the most because that has a large sample and it's based on likely voters, and that's why I tend to follow that one. They've got him at 37%. That's pretty bad. When you get down to, when you're south of 40 and you're into the 30s, that's pretty bad. That's pretty bad, especially when we're talking about likely voters. So that's just a reflection. I think a lot of Americans are disenchanted with President Biden. And what's starting to come out right now is that a lot of Democrats are also very disenchanted with him because they're seeing the results. They're seeing what's happening and they don't like what's happening. They don't like what's happening. I think a lot of independents are also very disenchanted with President Biden. And that's really the key vote, by the way. When you look at these groups, Democrats are generally going to vote Democrat. Republicans are generally going to vote Republican, but it's independents. They're the ones who basically go one way or the other. And in this case, they're moving away from President Biden. And I would argue that the reason is that President Biden ran on a campaign that he was going to be a moderate. And it has not turned out that way. He's not a moderate. He has not governed as a moderate. In fact, he has been more radical to the left than President Obama, which is a pretty amazing thing to say. So a lot of people are walking away from President Biden. Now, Democrats are doing it. It's interesting. President Biden went to Ohio to do a campaign rally, and the Democrat running for the Senate in Ohio didn't show up. When he came to Texas, Beto O'Rourke, who's running for governor, he didn't show up. So obviously, a lot of Democrats are very concerned about where their party's going and what's going to happen in November. Well, let me close with, on this day in history, just a quick reminder that on this day in 1914, that would make it 108 years ago, George Herman Ruth made his major league debut. Now, that's his real name, George Herman Ruth, and that's how he came up as a baseball player. Later on, he became the Babe, and that's when he started hitting home runs. But at the very beginning, he was a pitcher. He was a left-handed pitcher, and that's how he broke with the Red Sox on this day, 1914. He was actually a pretty good pitcher, set a major league record for World Series scoreless innings, pitching in the World Series. But eventually, they traded him to the Yankees in 1920, and the rest of the story. That's when he became Babe Ruth, and perhaps the biggest and most influential character in the history of Major League Baseball, certainly professional baseball. Well, thank you for listening. We'll chat later, And check out our podcast with Bill Katz later today, the Week in Review, and we'll be putting that on our different places, my blog, as well as the Facebook page. Have a great day, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas.